Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Today, we welcome Rebecca Martin to our podcast. As a PhD candidate at the Rutgers School of Social Work and a senior research specialist at the Rutgers Bluestein School of Planning and Public Policy, Rebecca's work for the New Jersey Inclusive Healthy Communities Grant Program is changing how we approach inclusion and community health. With a diverse background that spans from visual merchandising to service design to social work, Rebecca offers a unique perspective on the power of language, especially as it pertains to fostering inclusion. One's journey has been driven by a commitment to bridge gaps and build coalitions between historically marginalized communities and underrepresented groups, emphasizing the vital role that language plays in social justice and human connection. In this episode, hosted by Tru Adams, we'll dive into Rebecca's innovative approach to inclusive design and advocacy for evolving communication strategies that center around kindness, understanding, and respect. Take it away, Tru.
Thank you, Devron, and welcome again, Rebecca. Thank you so much for being here. That intro was amazing, but before we jump into all the things that we're going to cover, is there anything more you would like to add about you and your experience? And
No, that was a lovely introduction. Thank you.
nice.
Thanks for having me too.
Of course, of course. All right, so I want to start by just jumping into how it all began for you. So could you tell us what actually inspired your transition? I know you were originally in design and visual merchandising. Like, what was the journey between going from that to pursuing a career in social work, where your focus became doing advocacy for aging and disability for that inclusion of those communities? So what was the journey? How did it look? Because I wouldn't think it was linear, but can you tell us a little bit how you got from A to B?
For sure. It's funny because I was thinking, well, it wasn't a very linear journey, to be sure. So I think part of my personal story, which I think is probably where I should start, is that I was diagnosed with ADHD when I was 26. And I think that that is an important part of my story. At that time, I was working in retail in stores and as like a department manager. And I think that and I enjoyed that work a lot. And I enjoyed the people part of that work a lot, right? The interactions day to day and the managing of people. But it wasn't like my passion or my calling. And I think that part of my story is that once I got diagnosed and I had access to resources and medication and all the things, I feel like that was really a turning point in my life where I started to follow the things that really drove me more to kind of follow my path, right? And so within a year and a half, I was working in corporate retail, managing signage and displays for Toys R Us and Babies R Us for all their new and remodel stores. Like, it was this huge leap. I had moved different states. I was working at corporate. After that, I went to design school at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University, and I did a master's in design practices, which was just a fundamental change in how I think about things, how I think about services, how things are designed. It was a really great program that changed my life. And then, through this, when I was at Hong Kong Polytechnic University, a lot of what I was trying to do kept being about designing for groups of people around belonging, inclusion, trying to figure out ways to alter environments that would be more conducive to people existing in them in ways that felt comfortable for them, that were adaptable for them. And people kept joking around with me that maybe I was really a social worker at heart, because I kept trying to design these things. Because our program was a lot about like what kind of things you could design as a small business, so you could design the product and then the services that would kind of underlie that product. And fast forward a few years, I worked as a designer in Hong Kong, and then also educational design. And then I came back, had my daughter, and I was thinking about what I was going to do in the next step of my life. My mother-in-law is a marriage and family therapist, and she had always kind of wished she had gone into social work. And she said to me, I see this in you, and I really wonder if maybe you should go back to social work school rather than going back to design. What I think is really interesting is that the design part of me, like I still feel like I'm a designer because I feel like that part of us is like, it's something like innate. It's about how we look at the world, how we solve problems. And I take that with me in my social work journey. So I still feel like a designer, even though I'm now in the social work field, if that all makes sense.
No, that actually seems pretty linear, honestly.
Oh.
Yeah, Heather's like, that makes perfect sense. And it really does. And your focus on that, even while you were in school and in training on language and inclusion, I mean, that's incredibly impactful, and it kind of makes me wonder about how this perspective might kind of go towards like research methodologies. So given the focus on involving research and ways to better reflect changing identities, how do you see that the role of language within this evolution, particularly how we conduct and present research? Like, how do you see that going?
Well, so I think in a lot of ways, it feels like in research, we're tied to the language of the past. And I think there are a lot of reasons why this happens. In one way, we're tied a lot of times to data when we're doing quantitative research. We want to have these groups that are large enough that we can say something about the numbers. And so we tie them into the way that we've always measured different groups of people. But the way that we're measuring people doesn't really accurately reflect how people see themselves. And a lot of times, like for example, we don't necessarily often look to the government for the most innovative new ways of seeing things, right? But often when we measure when we measure groups of people, we look to the census. But the census is politically affected. It's something that is tied to tradition and it evolves very slowly. And we know there are lots of problems in how we measure people with that, but that's still how we capture data. So I think that that's one problem with how we're measuring things. And I have real concerns about how we're measuring people because I think a lot of what we're building in our new systems that are kind of underlying AI-driven and data-driven things that really impact people's lives, like healthcare systems and the information they have access to, are built kind of on these assumptions of who these people are. But what we're measuring doesn't reflect people. I'll tell you one thing that I think is really interesting that has happened in the past year, which is I was teaching a research class at a college in New Jersey that is considered a Hispanic Serving Institute. And it is because it has a large proportion of Hispanic students that go there. And we did just a survey because we were practicing our research skills amongst students that were there. And we did a very complex racial identity categorization, and we allowed people to choose whatever they wanted. We didn't separate ethnicity and race. And so people didn't have to choose a racial identity separate from Hispanic, but they could. And so what I think is fascinating is that traditionally we've always captured data where people who did not identify as Afro-Latino typically picked white and then Hispanic as ethnicity. But all of the students in the sample did not pick white at all. So for years and years and years, we've been forcing people to say that they're white who do not identify as white at all. And so what are we capturing there? And are we honoring those people? Like, I think that this is one of the things that's really important about the way that we're capturing data and whether we're honoring how people see themselves. And that's really true with disability as well. One of the things that I'm really passionate about is trying to capture disability data that is aligned with the social model of disability. And the social model of disability says that all people are part of the natural spectrum of what it is to be human, and that disability is part of that. And so rather than this disability being like a problem or something in and of itself that is bad or wrong or something we should change, that it's just a difference that is part of that spectrum. And that really, quite frequently, what is disabling is the interaction with an environment that is not built for the needs of that person in mind. Okay. And so what I want to capture is how much the way environments are designed and impact people, how much of an effect that has on how much disablement they experience in environments. Because then we can truly motivate people to change the environments. Right. Because it's not about the person. Many people with disabilities were removed from society when our modern society was built. So all of our structures were built in a way that didn't take their needs into consideration. So now what we need to focus on is how we can make these structures, environments, policies, systems all support everyone equitably. And that focuses on changing those things. So these are some of the ways that I think it's really important to capture these in new conceptual ways and to always be thinking about how we can capture identities and these concepts in ways that align with how people see themselves rather than the ways that we kind of forced people to identify in the past.
Right. That's so mind-blowing to speak on it because you're right. People like literally are blind to how forced the construct is, that we already have set up. And there's definitely opportunity and a necessity to change all of that. So speaking of developing like that type of strategy, like for communication with people with disabilities, let's shift and dive into that specifically. We spoke before, and you were an advocate for a 3-level communication, which included this micro, meso, and macro strategy when engaging with people with disabilities. So could you break that down and elaborate on what that looks like?
Sure. So the 3-level strategy kind of comes from a social work framework that we use in the field, which is based on our levels of practice. So it's micro, meso, and macro practice. And it's easiest if I start with micro and macro, and then we'll get to the complicated kind of messy middle afterward, okay?
Yeah.
So micro level is the individual to individual. And so a communication strategy for talking to people and deciding what kind of language you will use when you're talking to a person with disabilities would be in engaging them with the language that they use about their own experience. And so whether that is because you're asking directly what kind of language that person prefers, or if you are taking context clues from the language that they're using while they're talking to you and reflecting that back, probably a combination of those two things. Yeah. It's always most important that when you're having a conversation with 1, 2, 3 people in front of you, that you are using the language that they have indicated is most comfortable for them. It doesn't matter if it goes against all of the principles of your organization as a whole, right? Always honor that person in front of you. Then at the macro level, right, which is our big level, it's about our big advocacy, our organizational message that we're pushing outward. You want to empower your employees, your organization to feel like they are confident that they know what words they should be using, how they can approach this, so they have a clear understanding and they can do their work adequately. We can't engage a community if we can't talk about our work, right? And so this requires creating a communication guide for your organization that often, and there are really nice, reputable guides out there for media guides for where to start on disability. And this is something I can provide to you afterward that you can include out for people as resources, but that people could use as a starting point, right? That you can define words that you should be, like what words you should always be defining the first time they're used in a communication, what words we lean into. Do you want to always use person first language, which is person with disabilities, instead of identity first language, disabled person, right? So which things is your organization as a whole going to push out a message that's not in a conversation? How are you going to talk about those things? And then have it really clear for your organization so that people know how to do that in a way that is comfortable and consistent. The messy middle with the meso, okay? This is when you're doing your communication with groups of people. And a lot of times when I talk about this, I'm thinking more in terms of like running sort of social service groups or like small community organizing or whatever. But this really could work in any sort of smaller setting where you have maybe more people than you can necessarily use their individual preferences, but more people, but you want to be sure that you're still meeting their needs, right? So you want to give an opportunity for people to provide feedback, but not put people on the spot. Mm. You want to tell people, and I say always use transparency about why you've made the choices you've made. So if I'm going to talk about disability and I'm going to use person first language, I can acknowledge that I know that there are differences in preference on this, and I've chosen this because the majority of people in my group tend to prefer it. And that's where I'm standing. And then I'd like feedback. And if you get feedback, you can adapt your strategy. You can also alternate between different preferences. When I worked with people, I used to work with college students with vision impairments. Some would prefer to be called blind, and some would prefer to be referred to as having vision impairments. And I could alternate those in a group meeting so that everybody felt like they were being included and that they were being seen and that their preferences were honored. So a lot of times at the meso level, it's just really important to be transparent about why you're doing the things you're doing and to really solicit feedback about how people would like you to communicate, but not put anybody on the spot. Because that's the other thing I've seen sometimes where people will like call somebody out and ask them, hey, what do you think? Because they know somebody has a disability and you don't want to do that in a public setting.
Do you think that's going to be the same approach that organizations can start to adopt, or would there be a little bit of an adjustment for that grander scale?
I mean, I do think so. I think that the meso is just something that you wouldn't be using as frequently, right? If you're a major organization, but whoever is informing your strategy, right? Perhaps your macro strategy, instead of, you might start from a point of like using media guides and things like that, but maybe you will form a group of interested parties who would come and be an advisory to your media strategy, right? And then that group you could use the meso approach on to inform your ultimate strategy for your macro communication strategy.
That's amazing. So going back to specific communication, I want to talk a little bit about the etiquette, and you kind of talked about that a little bit. So what have been sort of the common mistakes that you've seen people make, and how do you think would be the best approach to ensure that they, start to immediately correct these things to ensure they're conveying the respect and the dignity that this community deserves?
So I think the number one thing is that we are going to make mistakes. All of us, absolutely. We live in this culture that we have a very ableist undercurrent. And as much as we try, even with the best of intentions, it seeps into the things that we say by accident even. And so we have to be aware and okay with that. And in my opinion, the best thing that we can do is just address in the moment any mistakes that we make, if we recognize it, and then, with sincerity, and then move forward, right? That being said, I mean, of course, that's uncomfortable, right? And it puts us in a vulnerable situation, but ignoring it and moving forward immediately undoes any of the goodwill that you've built, right?
Absolutely.
So it's like, it's such an essential key part of this process is like really owning it when we make a mistake. A couple of things that I think come up a lot are frequently we hear people say like suffering from chronic illness or disability. And that's just like something that we use in kind of the way we talk about these things, or living with disability or wheelchair bound. Some of these words that kind of have traditionally been used, but carry a little bit of a negative connotation.
Mm-hmm.
And I always say that I think it's really important that we really try to use neutral words, because what we might think an experience is like from outside of that experience might be very different from what somebody's experience is from inside of that experience.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't want to assume that you are suffering, that you feel bound in any way, that like, I want to give you a neutral platform to tell me about your experience, right? And so that's one thing that I think is really important. I think when there are things that have been used as nouns in the past, sometimes in dehumanizing ways, it's important to, and particularly like around mental health diagnoses and things like that, it's important to try to use person first language and make sure that that we are centering the person. There are some groups of people who as a whole tend to prefer identity first language, such as the deaf community and autistic community. But as a whole, I would lean into person first language more than identity first language because it is more comfortable for a lot of people. But again, I think the most important thing is listening to the people in front of you, because the disability community is very diverse. And then also, intersectionally, different communities have different ways of talking about disability also. And it's really best to really be listening to how people in front of us are speaking about their experience and then trying to use that language first and foremost.
Okay. So that actually triggered a totally separate question for me. When you were asking, which I love the fact that you're asking those individuals in those communities how they would like to be received and identified as. But in my case, my son who has autism, he is not that communicative. He does not have the capacity to have that kind of conversation and express, to a degree, he can express his wants and needs, but something this granular, he would never have the concept of. So when you're dealing with the sect in that capacity, how does that change anything with your approach or your structure? Like, how do you deal with that particular subgroup?
That's a really good question. So I think so do you feel that your son has a preference about the language?
I honestly do not believe he has a full awareness of what the condition is and how that is going to have him interact with his day-to-day life. It just is what it is. And that's kind of how I've approached his whole existence myself. He is my son. This is just the way that things are. This is our reality. This is how we deal with it. So I personally have never even labeled him until he got to an age where he aged out of school, and now we have to go through a whole nother level of care and things like that. So now I have to talk about it more. And I'm like, well, I don't have a name for this, so that's kind of where I'm at with that.
And I think it's really, okay, I'll answer this question in two different ways. Okay.
Sure.
So the first is to say that if he does not have a strong preference about the language, then I think as long as it's respectful language along one of the axes, then it's not really that important. Like it could be person first, it could be identity first. And as long as it's comfortable for him and comfortable for you, then that is important. And I generally say, so I focus a lot on the person with disabilities themselves. When the person with disabilities does not have a preference, then I would say then probably next would be asking the preference of the family member, right? Who is also involved in the conversation. Yeah. The reason I don't prioritize that in the conversation is that sometimes because of sort of the power dynamics with family members and children with disabilities, sometimes parents' preferences are placed over a child who does have a preference, right? So I try to balance that to make sure that people see those as two different stakeholders in the same kind of conversation. But I would say that in this case, if your son doesn't have a preference, then I would want to defer to your preference if I was having a conversation with the two of you. Okay, so that would be my first thing.
Yeah.
Then secondly, I would say that particularly when talking about things like autism spectrum disorder, where there's such a wide range of ways that that people present and different ways that they interact in the world and communicate, that it's really sometimes the label is almost not very helpful, right? Because what the conversation might be about is like what he might need in this particular moment, how he interacts in the community, what his communication style is. All of those things are needed because autism can look so different in so many different people. And so I don't think that a label should ever be like shorthand to cut off the conversation that is more about like how we support this person, because really that's what's important in creating this like community connection. And a lot of what I talk about kind of in these materials is kind of like first level engagement and trying to talk about groups of people or trying to like engage with people and not kind of break that bond from the very beginning by using words that are harmful or hurt people. But when it comes down to it, every person with disabilities experiences what they need in an environment different than every other person with disabilities. And so what we really need to talk about then, once that relationship has been established, is how we can make sure that people have full and meaningful opportunities to participate in community and to be themselves and to be seen and to live the lives that they want to live. Like all of those things are what's really important. And you can't get that with the label.
Right, absolutely. No, I fully agree with that. And even it is much as you have to really acknowledge and identify that people with disabilities are different individually, but also with each individual, even that disability may kind of be a little fluid, as you know, like my son is not the same person that he was when he first got into the system, and now that he's 21, you know, I have to be able to readily adapt to the things that he learns and the things that he, you know, can hold on to, and what his capacity level is. And I think that's really important, especially when we were talking briefly about how the caretaker or the parents kind of supersede, you know, the things that they want to set up for their children. We as parents have to be really cognizant of paying attention, you know, and being active advocates for the needs of our children as they progress through their lives. You know, so I mean, just sidebar, I just had, because my son is aging out of school, and he is now, what I did not do beforehand was to go through the whole guardianship process, because he was still my baby, and I totally forgot, you know, once he turns 18, he actually is an adult. So now we're going through that, and there is a legal assessment that has to come into that in order to eventually approve said guardianship. And the assessor has to speak to my son one-on-one. I was there, but I had to be silent and really listen to their interaction between the two of them without my input. And it was actually really phenomenal to see, you know, and it made me even realize that sometimes I forget, you know, that he's not a quote unquote baby. He does have his own thoughts. He does have his, you know, his own concerns, and the way he was expressing himself, even though it was limited, was his own, and I had to honor that. So yeah, that's extremely important. I'm so glad that that type of discussion and that type of thought process is being more relevant, becoming more relevant, and instituting. It's just a great thing. Yeah, I love that. So before I get emotional,
Can I say
so,
just one thing too?
yes,
Because what you just said also, you highlighted that he has changed over time. And I just want to point out that that is also one of the things that I think is so relevant when we're capturing data, because you had asked me about like how we measure these things, is that also people vary from day to day, like how many stressors he goes through in a day and how many things like, but the way that we capture data around disability is often like just this moment in time, right? Like it's just, and you can't capture all that there is to know about how someone is interacting in the world and their experiences in one moment. And I think that that's really important, because for some reason, while we understand that people without disabilities have a whole range of good days, bad days, days when we are successful, days when we fail, all of these things, and that's within the full range of what is expected in the human condition, for some reason, we think that what it is to be a person with disabilities is static, and every day is the same, and every day has to be a success. And if it's not, like there's no opportunity to fail. And if there's a failure, then that's a sign of the disability. It's not just a part of life experience. Like there's a dignity in failure. And we have to allow people with disabilities to have the opportunity to fail. So I feel like the variation that we have to be able to measure for people with disabilities needs to be honoring the full spectrum of life experience from day to day, recognizing that every day is not the same for anyone.
Yeah.
And I just
it's
wanted
the same grace we give
highlight
to
that from what you're
ourselves.
saying.
So why
Exactly,
would we not apply that to,
Exactly. Because I think there's a myth that people with disabilities have to strive every day. They have to overcome every day, right? And that's not realistic or fair to put on anyone.
No, absolutely. Wow. That was a great point. I'm so glad we delved into that. Okay. So I got over a little bit. Let's move on. I want to talk a little bit about what you spoke on about coalition building between underrepresented groups and the strategies that you found more or the most effective in uniting those diverse communities. So could you talk a little bit about that being a key aspect of your work now and kind of share a story that highlights that effectiveness in those type of strategies?
So I think, a part of what I'm doing now is that in my work, I guess I haven't even really talked about my work very much. I am the project manager for the Inclusive Healthy Communities grant program that is funded by the New Jersey Division of Disability Services. And it is a grant program that is awarded to people throughout New Jersey who are doing work to ensure that people with disabilities are included in integrated ways in community, and they come from all different kind of sectors. So there's people who focus on like nature access, and people who focus on healthcare, and people who focus on municipal engagement, and people with disabilities as advisors and decision makers and things like this, right? So and part of what we do in this grant program that makes it interesting and special is that we provide capacity building opportunities for the grantees, because a lot of them have focused on more like direct service work until this point. And so we're trying to shift them towards this like advocacy, policy, systems, and environmental change kind of work. And as part of that, we provide like a training webinar series that is free to anyone who wants to watch. And we get people throughout New Jersey, also in other states. Like it's great. And I run that series. And so we take great care to try to bring this kind of inclusive language, this inclusive lens to the work that we're doing. And particularly, I think what I see when I feel like this is a success, because often we'll have people who identify as self-advocates on these calls as well. And so when I feel it's a success is when people who identify as self-advocates feel empowered to share their own experiences, to ask questions, to contribute in the calls. Mm-hmm. Like that's when I feel like what we are doing is working, and that we're really like bringing together the groups of people, because I don't want our program that comes from the Blaustein Center at Rutgers in this academic-y way to be doing this in a way that does not highlight the voices of people with disabilities. Like I want people with disabilities to be involved in as many ways as possible in important roles in decision making, speaking about their own lives, being experts through their lived experience. And so, and more, we have had people who identify as self-advocates who attend these calls and contribute. And I feel like that has really been a win, because not only is it showing that we're providing that meaning to them, but also it's an excellent opportunity for people who don't have that connection yet with people with lived experience to really hear from them directly and to see what a benefit it is to have people advising you on the projects that you're working on.
Wow. So I still love this conversation. Let's switch gears just a little bit, because we're going to go back to something that you shared with me about your thoughts about how design practices differ across the fields and how you would like to kind of address those kind of things. So you mentioned there was like a noticeable difference between design approaches in products and service designs and it being designed to be accessible for the public, but kind of overlooking the accessibility for the professionals behind the scenes on the back end that are actually doing the research and development. So how do you think that needs to be kind of addressed?
Thank you for asking this. This is something I think about a lot, and I think so. In particular, I personally use a screen reader sometimes. It helps me with cognitive load, and I'm just a very auditory person, so it really helps me process things. And because of my strong ties with the community of blind and visually impaired people, I have also had a number of colleagues who use screen readers. And I'm finding so frequently that so many of the services that are available and software and things that people are designing, they are designing with the idea that the end user should be able to access things, but not the person doing the work within the system. And I'm finding this to be so frustrating. So, for example, I had a colleague who was helping me, well, was supposed to help me do some qualitative coding on some research that we did. And we searched very hard to try to find some qualitative software that would work with her screen reader. And we ended up having to find this kind of obscure one out of Europe that was just kind of like up and coming. This was a couple years ago, and now they have a bigger presence. But almost all of the main name qualitative coding softwares that are meant for academic researchers, you cannot use a screen reader as the person doing the coding. It doesn't work within the system. You can output all sorts of reports and things after you've done that and share them out, and those are all accessible, but things are not being built for the professionals to be accessible. And this is true of like HR systems. This is true like in all sorts of different kinds of processes. And I just really want, if there are people listening to this who work in this kind of UX design, I just want you to think about your kind of, I know, because, coming from design, I know we think about like who our target users are. And more, I feel like we're creating these ideas of people with disabilities who are our potential users on the consumer end. And we're trying to design so that the consumer end is accessible for those people, but we are not considering them as the experts, the employees, and the people on the other side that need to be able to use these types of software.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Oh my goodness. So we went through, I'm so pleased that we had this conversation, and we've exhausted all of my questions that were answered beautifully. So I'm gonna go into the chat and see if there were any questions from the audience. So Heather asked, have you considered speaking in live events? I know you do the online presentations. Do you do anything like in real settings?
Sure, invite me.
Ha ha ha. There you go. Oh, and she said, or did you ever consider writing a book on this topic?
There are some long-term goals maybe that I could. Yes, I do feel very passionately about a number of these things, and I do hope to kind of try to spread a message about a number of them at some point. And I'm here today, Tru, because you found me and you invited me. And if people invite me to come and speak, I will certainly do it.
Absolutely. Amazing. All right. Devron has a question. He said, when it comes to creating environments, do you have three of the most important things to consider, or things that are easy to integrate into existing spaces that would help with communication?
That would help with communication. Oh, threw me off there for a second. Okay, let me think. So I do want to say that one, we have a lot of technology in spaces when we're having like meetings and things that we kind of refuse to use culturally, right? Like a lot of times we just don't want to use the microphone. If it's a small space, we feel uncomfortable. It makes us feel awkward. We don't want to do it. Like, absolutely, we should just be embracing that. And I've even been in spaces where it's like disability community related for like one disability, and we won't use microphones for people who have more than one disability, and that really needs to be a focus. If we have the technology available, we should be using it for sure. I would say that one thing that's really important, I think, and this is kind of in like moderated spaces online, a lot of times we use breakout rooms nowadays, for conversations. I would ask people to consider that if you're going to do that, having somebody in the breakout room that is meant to moderate, because a lot of times people who are neurodivergent may not have the same timing or the same ability to kind of break into the conversation in the same way. And sometimes it's necessary to have somebody there who can make sure that everybody has the opportunity to participate. That can be really frustrating. I had a speaker who I worked with for Inclusive Healthy Communities, and he uses assistive technology device for speaking, augmented communication. And Zoom doesn't pick up on the sound right away as a voice. And so when he is speaking with his device and someone else speaks, it automatically goes to the other voice as the first voice. So it's very, very difficult for him to break in. So there are many reasons why it would be really great to have somebody in that kind of role. The other thing is something that I typically have been doing for events is I try to ask people what would be useful to allow them to be fully present in the meeting or the training, and then provide a number of accessibility options, and then also like an open answer. And I ask this not as an accessibility question necessarily, or like disability, like not tied to disability, and also not as an accommodation, because I think there are often ways in which even people who don't identify as having disabilities know that they can absorb information better with certain supports. And why shouldn't we be ultimately trying to make all of these things as accessible as possible for everyone to learn in the ways that are most comfortable for them? Now that we have the technology, now that we can provide information in multiple different ways, why not kind of lean into that and do our best to make things available when we can? So I would just say that kind of providing that as an overall, and it kind of takes away the stigma of having to ask for something in a different format or to have a certain service turned on, because it's available to everyone.
It's already there, right? Smart. All right, moving on. Thank you for that. Also ask, how do we become more connected to groups, organizations, and communities focused on inclusion and actively creating a real impact? So how do we reach out and start networking and start building these structures?
That's a great question. So the Inclusive Healthy Communities grant program that I'm a part of what we do is we try to create this community and this network. So certainly if you have an interest and you want to reach out to me, like I will help connect you to people who are also doing this kind of work and interested. You can check out our website, which is inclusivehealthycommunities.org, and see the different kinds of programs that have been involved. Additionally, I think, every place that is doing a focus on DEI, DEIJB, DEIA, like whichever version of that we are doing, really like disability should be a part of that. And I think that it's gotten lost in some of it, right? But, disability is overrepresented in nearly every group that is otherwise like marginalized by other social identity, right? Like it is higher represented in people of color. It is more people are LGBTQ who have disabilities. Like there are just so any group that you are trying to support, if you're trying to create an environment that is inclusive for the whole person, then disability is relevant. So I would say, please, if you're already involved in this kind of work in supporting other people, please try to consider what you might be able to do within kind of your own house as well. And if you need guidance or where to find resources, like please reach out to me too, and I will help you find them.
Nice. So for what you do in that organization, he also asked, like, how do we train teams to communicate effectively and empathetically with individuals? Is that part of the things that you support and give guidance for?
Can you repeat that one?
Yeah,
Sorry.
sure. So how do we train our teams to communicate effectively and empathetically with individuals from diverse backgrounds and with different abilities?
Well, I think we do have so all of our previous webinars are all available on our website. So please feel free to peruse those resources. I think that many of them are useful.
Mm.
We're also always sort of leaning into new trainings on that as well.
Awesome.
I think I would have to find other resources for you if you had a specific interest you were looking for.
I'll ask him if was there anything specific he was actually questioning, but if not, we will move on. There was another question. Where do you see yourself within the next 5 years? And can you please, for the audience, say where to contact you? I know we already joked that you don't really have a presence online, but ways to actually connect with you for more information.
Okay. Well, you can email me at rebecca.martin@rutgers.edu. I'm Rebecca with 2 C's. And you can contact me on LinkedIn, and my profile is Rebecca-Martin-LSW.
Okay.
Yes. And then where do I see myself in the next 5 years?
Yes.
Well, hopefully I will have completed my PhD and will be teaching and doing research to advance what we know about people with disabilities, particularly in the ways that they thrive. I feel like so much of the research that we have available to us is about disability in ways that seems unempowered. And so much of the research has been done, for example, until recently, bringing it back to autism research, but there's been this kind of fallacy that people with autism don't have empathy. Like that's even sort of been part of the diagnostic sort of understanding people have of people with autism. But now, recent research, now that there are researchers with autism starting to ask some of the questions, right? Yeah. They're finding that there's like a double empathy where people with autism show high empathy with other people with autism, and people who are neurotypical show high empathy with people who are neurotypical, but not with people who are autistic, right? So there are questions out there that need to be asked that highlight that people with disabilities do thrive, and we're just missing it in a lot of different ways. The reason I came back to school actually was I was working with college students who are blind and have vision impairments, and I came up with this tool to harken back to design, right? I came up with this idea that I wanted to create a web-based tool that would allow people with disabilities to search for colleges where they would be successful, that would integrate the other kinds of information that you would like to know in your college search, like the demographics, the size of the school, what kind of majors they have, all the kind of stuff you typically look for online, along with what kind of disability supports they have, what the reputation is, what the kind of cultural environment is for people with disabilities. And then taking into account, all of the things that are really important, like, if you have a particular religious need, if you have dietary needs, if you, culturally need a particular background to be available, like all of these things, right? And it's not available. And I started looking for research on what makes some colleges more successful in supporting students with disabilities than others, and there just wasn't any data. And so that was why I came back to school, because I thought there's just not a lot of data that shows all of the things that support people with disabilities, like the things that are good and the things that show them thriving. But I see it every day. Like I see people with disabilities thriving in life, despite the fact that it takes so much more work. Like the fact that to get to the ramp on the side of the building, you have to go 3/4, like 3 times as far, and then you have to enter the wrong entrance, and then you have to go the whole way across the bottom and up the elevator just to get to the lobby, right? Nobody thinks about all the extra work that people with disabilities are doing.
Yeah.
And so I just want to be able to document these things and try to find ways that we can really push the needle so that we're moving away from this idea of disability as an embodied deficit and into an idea that the environment is failing people with disabilities because it wasn't designed for them. And we can change that because that is outside of people.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I'm standing on that. That's really important, and you're right. And I think it just plays into, I don't want to call people inherently lazy. I would hate to do that, like, on record, but it feels like because these things that we've taken advantage of or taken for granted, we collectively are not inclined to make those changes because it doesn't impact us enough. And I think that that's the beginning of the problem. And you're right. Once we get people like you and your collective actually actively working on it, and we all join in, that's when the change is going to happen. And yeah, that definitely needs to move. That definitely needs to move. So, all right, we're almost out of time. And we usually end with a question about, well, not a question, but a request of whether or not you have anyone that you want to shout out, the people that maybe have inspired you along your journey or have helped you along. Is there anybody that comes to mind?
Well, I have to shout out the late great Judy Heumann. You know, I mean, she was such an inspirational person in the disability rights movement, and she was supposed to come to Rutgers last year, but she passed away before she got to. So we all missed out on the opportunity to see her, which I'm very sad about. But I think that, you know, she really did so much to get people talking, and to show she just showed the power of like what one person can do when they set their mind to it and then work in a collective action with other people who are doing the same thing, right? It's just like one person doing their part with one person doing their part with one person doing their part. And before you know it, it's a whole community changing things by everybody just carrying a little bit of the load together.
Right.
And I think I want to say that one thing that really inspired me that we didn't talk about, but I think is really pivotal, is that the United Nations has a Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And the United States is not a part of that because we don't really get involved in conventions because we don't want other nations to compel us to act. And we have a whole lot of reasons, but it is theoretically oriented toward the Americans with Disabilities Act, or like inspired by, but it extends beyond. And it's what the rest of the world is trying to do about disability. And it is so pivotal in really thinking about disability and what true inclusion is, and what is meaningful, how to interact with children who have disabilities to understand their perspectives. Like, there's so much about the CRPD that is really like that fundamentally changed my view. And I think if I hadn't studied outside of the United States and had exposure to that, I never would have. And this was like a core piece of influencing my learning and my trajectory in this work. And so I would just really recommend that anybody who's not familiar with the CRPD, like, really learn about it a little bit, because I think as the United States, we think that we're at the front of advancements, but really, like, there's so much more we could be doing. Right. And a lot of the great work that's being done is happening outside of the United States. And there's so much we can learn from looking at international disability rights work.
Right. Absolutely. Oh my God. Thank you for that. So Becca, thank you so much for being here and for talking. This was really important for me to have this conversation. And I'm sure it's going to be very pivotal for a lot of people that listen in to what you had to say and the things that you had to share. So we so appreciate you coming to speak with us. And yeah, is there any final thoughts for you, or?
No, just thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. It's been such a lovely experience being around my design-minded people and getting to share this with you. I appreciate you opening your hearts to the things that I'm passionate about and really welcoming me in. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.